I would also like to thank so much Miss Sandra Robinson, and she has been collaborating with ITEN for the last few months and doing technical cooperation among Eastern Caribbean countries. It's a pleasure for me to greet you, Sandra, and tell the audience here a little bit about you. Ms. Robinson is a lecturer in English education at the School of Education at the University of the West Indies in Cave Hill, the Cave Hill campus in Barbados. And she brings more than 20 years experience in teaching, in teacher education and development. She specializes in the theme of critical thinking and teaching teachers how to promote critical thinking in the classrooms. For 15 years, Dr. Robinson taught English at the secondary school level, and today she's more focused on teacher educators and giving professional development for teachers. Dr. Robinson, we really thank you so much for your willingness to share your expertise, your knowledge, and to really give us your valuable time. And I'm going to now pass the floor to you. And thank you so much again, and welcome everybody to this webinar.
Thank you very much, and good morning and good evening to everyone, and again, welcome. I want to begin by saying thank you to ITEN for inviting me to share this time with you, and I look forward to an engaging and interactive experience. Um, there's no need for me to go back into background again, that was just shared with you. So I'm going to go right into some of the guiding questions that I want to use to sort of um, guide what we will discuss today. I thought we'd begin first by thinking about why we need thinking classrooms. This is something that has been talked about all over, well, at least in the region where I live in the Eastern Caribbean and everywhere else around the globe. So I thought we'd begin by thinking about that question, and then moving on to think about how, as educators, we might create those conditions that would facilitate the kind of thinking that we are asked to enable in our students in our classrooms. And then what are some of those activities that might make that the kind of learning and thinking visible that students do need in this 21st century. And then finally, to talk about, or for us to even begin a conversation with regard to how we might map our teaching as teachers and teacher educators to create this kind of thinking in our classrooms. And so today, besides looking back on my own experiences, I'm going to be drawing on his work. Lynn Erickson has done quite a lot of work on instruction for the thinking classroom, looking at the concept-based curriculum. So I'm going to be drawing from that work. Joel Warrican is a Caribbean educator who has also done quite a lot of work in literacy education and what thinking might look like, especially in the Caribbean classroom. So also going to be drawing from his work. Ron Richard has also worked with Project Zero, and I'm going to, Project Zero is an activity, so to speak, that has been the brainchild of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I'm going to be drawing on the work of both. So, having said that, I'm going to begin by saying that, that critical thinking is a buzzword everywhere in education, and it transcends all aspects of life. It is required everywhere and at every level, and even more so in the time in which we live. But teaching for critical thinking still remains a a challenge. There is still a missing link because as much as teachers do recognize and acknowledge that this is something that they do need in their classroom, there is still that challenge with regard to how they might include it in their instruction and in learning. And therefore, it leads us to think about these questions. If critical thinking is important, it's an important aspect of teaching and learning in our classroom. Why are we not seeing evidence of this thinking in our students in our classroom? And what is getting in the way of that happening? When we do ask that question, the response, unfortunately, is really more questions because teachers are saying, yes, we want to do this. But then when I think about a learning experience, what might that look like? How do I know when my students have learned something? When students are thinking, what should they look like? What are the expectations that I should have?
Sandra?
Please?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but those people saying that they cannot hear you very well. Could you please try to set the volume of your microphone higher so that way they can hear you? Thank you. Remember the microphone icon in the upper part of the window, which has an arrow pointing down, and if you click on it, that's the adjust microphone volume.
It's, are you hearing me better now? Hello? Hi.
Yes, people are saying that they can hear you much better.
So let me just go back and just a quick review. The point that I was making earlier is that critical thinking is something that is required everywhere and that it is at every level, but certainly there's still challenges with regard to how teachers might make that visible in their classroom. And I ask us to think about what might be getting in the way of enabling that in our classrooms, especially because even as we think about that, there are still more questions which arise in the process. The research challenges us that the 21st century does require critical thinking skills, but perceptions vary about what these might look like. Certainly according to classrooms and across regions. And then there are teachers who are encouraged to increase their higher order thinking because this is understood to facilitate critical thinking. But there's no evidence actually in the research to suggest that answering higher order questions alone can actually affect thinking in students. And then there is that aspect of the training where it is recognized at the level of training that teachers do need to engage in critical thinking practice, but they still do leave the training not feeling comfortable or assured in themselves with regard to how to teach critical thinking. But that's the bad news, and there is still some encouragement in the research which suggests that if the thinking skills and dispositions that we want to see in our students are made explicit to them, then they come to internalize that. We are also encouraging the research that learning is visible. When learning is visible, it enables the knowledge to become deeper. There are also instructional techniques which I'm hoping to share with you today that can help to facilitate the kind of thinking we are acting in our classrooms, and also that learning is something that we can indeed make visible. So that leads me to our second guiding question, which is how might we create the conditions to assess the activities and techniques that are central to critical thinking. George Bernard Shaw in one of his writings, suggests that what we want to see is the child in pursuit of knowledge and not knowledge in pursuit of the child. And in a way, often that is something that we see around us, because children and learners and students often feel as if there is this burden on them when they're trying to pursue knowledge. And then John Dewey, that famous educator, says to us that in the light of all of that, what is even more important is the quality of the experience that we are exposing our students to. So the $1,000,000 questions really is, when you tell, who does the thinking? Because this is sometimes a practice that we have so often in our classroom, that we believe that learning comes from telling the student. But when you ask who does the thinking, and if we think about those two questions, the response really becomes obvious. When we think about teaching with a focus on direct instruction and thinking skills, these are some of the things that I'm suggesting that we think about. Do students know how to perform the task? Can the students describe the steps? Can students correctly label the skills when they use them? And do students apply the skills spontaneously when solving problems? It's important for us to consider these questions when we are actually planning and designing instruction for thinking in our classrooms. Richard also points to some forces that can either disable or enable thinking in our classroom according to how we pay attention to them. And one of those forces that he makes reference to is time. Often we ask questions in our classrooms and we do not give students enough time to think about the response that we're looking for. And the idea here is that time facilitates thoughtful response. Another thing is opportunity. Providing opportunities in our classroom instruction that will engage students in purposeful activities. We can either disable or enable that in our classroom. There are also the routines and structures also in our classroom can either scaffold the students' thinking or disable that. And then another aspect that we need to consider is the language. How does our language, or the use of language, facilitate thinking and reflection in our students? And then there's the physical environment. How do we display the process of thinking? Because that is something that can be made visible to students also. There are 8 forces that Richard points to. I'm sharing 6 of them here with you. And we talk also about the expectation that we have of our students. Whether we are valuing the process of thinking in our instruction, or our focus is just simply on getting them to complete the task. And so therefore, some other points to ponder in light of that is remembering that enabling students' thinking does not require that we ask more why or how questions, but it does require us to be more explicit in the instruction that we give with regard to how to think about those questions, and not focus so much on the answer but the response. Because the idea is that when we focus on answer, we box students into looking for something that is right and correct, as opposed to a response which enables or opens up the opportunity for them to begin the process of thinking. Because ultimately, really, they will forget the fact, but they will always remember the understanding. So, what activities, therefore, are central to making learning and thinking visible in today's classroom? I would like to say at this point some thoughtful, and I deliberately use the word thoughtful because we can have thoughtless activities where not enough thought has gone into it, and activities which do not at the same time encourage the kind of thinking that we're looking for in our students. So the first technique I'd like to talk about is thinking routines. Some of you may have been using thinking routines in your classrooms, so this would be a good opportunity to revisit that. Thinking routines are really patterns of conversations that can be used to make students' thinking visible to them and to you as the teacher. So I want to pause and ask you to engage in a brief activity. So this is a compass point. I'm going to ask you which of the following best describes your feelings towards today's webinar. You can take a half a minute and indicate whether it's N, whether it's S, whether it's E, whether it's W. And this in itself is a thinking routine that you can use to begin the conversation with your student on any topic that you are going to be considering in your instruction. So, having thought about that, let me just go back a bit, and we're going to come back to the compass points in a moment. Thinking routines, as I said, are a form of visible thinking, which includes strategies that you can use. But the main point that I want to make with regard to that is that each routine targets a different type of thinking. And each thinking disposition has several thinking routines connected to it. So you can be requiring your students to question or investigate or to observe or describe something. You may want them to compare or connect concepts, or you may just simply want them to explore viewpoints. All of these are thinking dispositions, and the idea is that they are thinking routines which can support the thinking disposition that you would like to see visible in your students. So going back now to the compass points. The compass point really helps students to explore an idea before they take a stand on it. So there are 4 questions that are asked. What do you need to know? What are you excited about? What are you excited about, or what is your stance? What are you excited about, and what worries you? And the responses are recorded as directions of a compass, really just to provide a visual anchor, as you can see here. Another thinking routine, and I'm sure many of you may have used this in your classrooms before, is think, pair, share. And this is a routine that enables active reasoning, and I'm being verbatim here. But it's really, visually, as I have it there, 3 stages of thinking action in which the students are engaged. So a question is asked to provoke the thinking. You can provide a prompt that provokes the thinking in the student, and then they think on their own, which really is a wonderful opportunity to facilitate wait time. And then the students are paired to talk about the thinking that they would have done on their own. And then there is sharing eventually with the whole class. So the thinking is taking place at 3 different stages. And this particular routine really structures the discussion in the class and provides a lot of wait time for the student, which is something that we want, and which goes back to the notion of time being an important force in facilitating thinking in the classroom. So here are some more thinking routines, each of which has a particular thinking disposition attached to it. Whether you're looking for diverse perspectives, or you want to move into deeper inquiry, or you want them to reflect on how or why their thinking might have changed with regard to a particular concept, or you want them to justify an interpretation they have made. The idea is that this thinking can be made visible, and the learning that they're experiencing can be made visible through the use of thinking routines. So what is the instructional procedure? You really just simply move to the step. You target the specific types of thinking that you're after, whether it's before, during, or after the task. But it's also important to provide support when the students are actually engaged in the routine, whether it's through questioning or getting them to interact with their peer. But the fourth thing I want to point to more importantly here is that this is a routine because it is something that is repeated over and over again. And so that repetition is what facilitates the routinizing of the thinking, so to speak. And, and as such, more or less leads to the idea that it becomes a routine way of thinking about things. And again, this can be used whether it's in groups or with individuals. And the literature points to several benefits of thinking routines. Um, it really overall just helps to make concrete some of the concepts that students might be grappling with, deepen their understanding of content, and create their interest and motivation for learning. But also sort of shifting the classroom culture um, towards one of collaboration and community also among learners. So here are some sources for thinking routines. Again, I point you back to the Project Zero idea. That's on visible thinking, gpz.org. There are also routines which can support mathematical thinking, and these are more visual, which you can find on the teachingchannel.org. And again, the others focus on creating that culture of thinking in your classroom. The second idea that I'd like to share with you, again, I'm sure many of you may have used these in your classroom before, but it's the idea of conceptual lens and using mind or concept mapping to facilitate that. Concept maps are diagrams that are really used to visually outline information. And some of you may be familiar with these. They can be created around the main idea, a concept or story, and then this idea can be broken down into smaller or supporting ideas or points that you can see in this map here. And concept maps, because of the movement from a main idea to smaller ideas, can also be quite analytical because of that movement from the big idea to the smaller sub-idea. And so the benefits of concept map is that it does two very important things to make thinking visible. It documents the thinking and in a sense really recalls it and gives evidence to that thinking. I think often sometimes we can become preoccupied with the completion of the task itself without looking for opportunities where students are making their thinking evident in what they have written or in what they have produced. And I think concept maps are a wonderful way to document that thinking and provide opportunities for us to look at the evidence of the students' thinking as they engage in the task or each of these tasks in the classroom. The other thing is that by using concept maps to make learning visible, both the teacher and the student are able to determine what is known and what is understood. And there are also wonderful opportunities for learners to extract meaning from information. Of course, we have students in our classroom who are not always visual learners, but this is one opportunity perhaps for students to probably break down very complex information and create a visual evidence of it so that they too can track the thinking that they are pulling from the experience that they have um, with the work in which they're engaged. So again, breaking down and giving clarity to text and abstract ideas. So how is concept mapping a thoughtful activity? As I said before, because it makes understanding concrete and visual, it organizes the information and then invites learners to bring their own thinking to what they study. And it conceptualizes the knowledge in very tangible ways for both learners and teachers. So which of these statements most closely reflects your engagement with concept? Is it A, you use concept maps before and you use them before you begin a task, or you use concept maps after you begin the task, after you complete the task, or you use concept maps before, during, and after the task, or you've never used concept maps? Well, let's consolidate this a little bit more. Some examples of concept maps can include Venn diagrams. And Venn diagrams can be used to help learners show and record different relationships among ideas, where the ideas differ and where they overlap. And that overlapping we can see especially in those middle areas where the two circles meet or the three circles converge. And then there are also circle maps. These are mind maps, so to speak, which document areas of influence, and they show degrees of influence on an event or a situation, from the least to the greatest influence. And so if we look at what is there visually, in this case, the individual is influenced by the family and the school is influenced by the local community, and then from the national perspective, and then from the global perspective, again, the idea of the movement of influence. And then there are compare and contrast maps, which show how things are alike and different. Obviously, comparing shows how things are similar, and contrasting shows how things are different. And this requires the student to evaluate and synthesize the information and then make their understanding visible. So the idea here is, when it comes to concept map, is that we can improve student learning and teach students to be critical thinkers by asking them to identify similarities and differences among ideas or events, and then asking them now to classify that information. So when we find learning connections and concept building needs some kind of redirection or correction, concept maps or mind maps are good ideas or good techniques to help to put students back on track. And again, some examples for developing concept maps can be found at educationoasis.com, and this also allows you to create and design your own concept maps. The third and final idea or technique that I'd like to share with you is labeling the thinking. In this instance, what really happens here is we may ask students often to do something without naming that thing that we want them to do in their mind. And often I say to colleagues that, well, you know, we assume that students know how to learn without recognizing sometimes that we need to model that learning for them. So if you look at the examples here, the column on the left is actually indicating the task that we want the students to be engaged in. The column on the right restructures the instruction by labeling the thinking on naming the process. So let's look at these two pictures. If we relabel that, that becomes, let's compare these two pictures. And in that moment, we are naming for the student the thinking that might facilitate the task that we are asking them to become. And if we go down to the same thing, what do you think will happen? What do you predict will happen? Or let's work this problem. Let's analyze this problem. So it's about thinking carefully about how we design those instructions and understanding what is the learning and the thinking that you're after and making that visible for the student so that they know how they might begin to engage in that process. Sometimes students do not know where to begin, and making that thinking visible to them is a good and important starting point. Another way of labeling the thinking is how we question. What is the intention behind the questioning? Three ideas have been offered about plurals, tentativeness, and invitational sense. And what these really mean is, for example, if you were to ask, what is your response to what you have just read? Learners may begin to respond with hesitation because they're not sure whether you're looking for a specific response. And if they do not believe that they have that specific response, right away the thinking is shut down. But if we rephrase that again by labeling it in a different kind of way, what are some responses you have to what you have just read? Then that opens up the opportunity for them to think about, well, how do I feel? What do I think about? Because it's not a definitive response that is being sought. What thoughts do you have? What goals do you see? And so by making plural the intention behind your questioning, you are facilitating the kind of thinking that will help students engage in a more analytical way with the material. Then there's the idea of questioning with a tentative intention. What might be some factors that would cause, as opposed to what are the factors that would cause? So again, removing that specificity and opening up the opportunity for them to begin to recognize that it is possible that I can think about some things, as opposed to, well, I don't know what that specific thing that you're thinking about might look like. And then there are the invitational steps. Validating already that the student comes to the instruction, comes to the process of teaching and learning with some knowing already. So as you recall, or given that you know already, you're reminding them of that thing that they have already engaged with. And say to them, well, I'm valuing the thinking that you're bringing to this process. So, after all of that, therefore, how might we begin to map our teaching to create thinking classrooms? I want to suggest first that a useful place to begin is for us to consider what is the story of learning in our classrooms. What does that look like? How do you know when learning has occurred in your classroom? When is it most likely to occur? Who defines it? When learning has occurred, what are the student characteristics? What do your students look like when they are learning or they have learned? What does the context look like when learning is taking place or learning has taken place? What do you look like as a teacher when learning is taking place or has taken place? And how is learning made visible to your students, their peers, and to you? These are important aspects or plots, so to speak, in the story of learning in your classroom. And they are plots that we need to consider. The second um, idea that I'd like to encourage us to consider is the importance of establishing the thinking ideals. It's not enough to say that the students are not thinking, or I'd like you to think about that. Again, this is linking back to the idea of labeling that thinking disposition. Do you want them to describe? Do you want them to consider different viewpoints? Do you want them to make connections? Do you want them to form conclusions? That has to be made visible to us first as teachers before we can make it visible to them. And so if we don't establish the thinking ideals that we are after, then it becomes very confusing to students because they don't know how to begin to show you what they know and to show you what they understand. And so that's the second thing I'd like to share with us that we consider. And third and finally is about the way we begin to select our content. To think about and decide certain things when we are doing that, when we're selecting the content. On what standards is learning based? What essential questions will be addressed? Upon what prior knowledge must students draw? What would serve as indicators of learning and understanding? That has to be made visible to us first as educators. And this is one of the ways in which we can begin to map out our teaching. These are some of the ways that we can begin to map out our teaching to create thinking classrooms. So, making learning visible enables learners to provide evidence of what they have learned and how they have learned it. It enables them to compare and connect information. It enables them to summarize and to explore multiple perspectives and to draw conclusions. But in the words of David Perkins, this is possible only when we pay attention to this, that teaching is less about what the teacher does than about what the teacher gets the students to do. Thank you very much for your time, ladies and gentlemen, and we pause now for some questions.